Now is the time for the Q&A portion of today's talk. If you didn't get a piece of paper when you came in, please raise your hand and one of our volunteers will give you a piece of paper so you can write your question on there, and it'll be passed up to me and I'll direct the questions to Dr. Shin.
Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Shin. So first of all, a little bit about your personal history. Are you a native of Gwangju?
No, I'm from Chungcheong province. The province traditionally is well known that non-participating in street demonstration. So I have never participated in street demonstration.
Okay. So when did you come to Gwangju? You mentioned it was after the events of May 18.
So after college graduation, I came here 1971 as a Air Force officer. So I came here to teach English to student pilots. And then I got married in 1974 to a girl here, who is a grandmother of my child. And then I was not here in 1980 because I was studying in the US. I came back to Gwangju 1971 to begin to teach at Chonnam National.
Okay. So is it being here in Gwangju and the environment and attitude towards activism here, is that what leads you to be so interested in uprisings and movements across Korea?
In fact, from my primary school days, I was quite a lot interested in social issues. I think it was the influence of reading. I read a lot. At that time, not many books available, so I read only like some scraps of paper. Anyway, I read everything at that time. So from this kind of reading, I began to realize that the government at the time, the president at that time was a bad guy, and then they committed a lot of crimes to the people. So I began to realize or exposed to the social issues from when I was very young. Maybe I was born that way because I frequently questioned the teaching of teachers. So I was reprimanded by them, you talk too much. And then at that time, the real virtue is being silent, because people were, at that time, teachers, my parent generations, they underwent so much atrocities or so much prejudice they saw anyway the participants suffering. So they all preached us to be silent. So I was taught to be silent, but I refused to be silent, and then I questioned many things. Maybe it is genetic trait, I'm not sure, but I talk back to the teachers quite frequently. So whenever I could, I try to change the situations. So while I was teaching at Chonnam National, I was not in good terms with my colleagues quite frequently because I talked back to my senior members in the department. So I do not think I have been quite tremendously influenced by the situation in Gwangju, but I rather interpreted it frequently this way. As a teacher at Chonnam National, I experienced students being imprisoned, tortured. So whenever I became quite egoistic, I try to be less egoistic, because compared to their suffering, my money is nothing. That's what I began to think. So that's why I never regretted my donation to GIC and to other organizations. So even though I retired from the university, still I support nearly 10 organizations out of my pocket, including GIC. So I can do it because not only because of my experience in Gwangju, but like activists in colonial rule, and then activists in 1970s, 60s when I was younger, and then activists in 1980s. Because of that experience, I try to share my possession with the community. So I am influenced, but somewhat, yes.
And so is your sort of lifelong interest in these kind of topics the reason you chose to talk about this today specifically, or are there any other specific reasons for choosing today's topic?
Because I was asked to talk about March 1st movement. And this is my favorite topic.
It's a good reason.
Yeah.
So moving on to some of the other movements that you briefly touched upon at the start of your talk, you mentioned the 1948 Jeju massacre. Is that more or less well known throughout Korea than May 18th in Gwangju?
It was a kind of taboo. No history book could touch upon that incident until after Gwangju. So I read some broken magazine about that incident. So until 1980s, not many people were aware of Jeju massacre. Jeju residents became vocal only after Gwangju became recognized as a democratic movement. Before then, they were silent. They suffered so much. And then they could not talk about it. They could not dare talk about it.
So considering how Jola has become this bastion for humanitarian causes and human rights, and what Jeju has suffered, can you explain the difference in the sort of attitudes in Jeju versus Jola?
Even though the killing was much larger scale, maybe 300 times of people were killed in Jeju Island. But the impact was not big of that incident because it was isolated island. And then in 1980, the image, like the video image and the photo images were produced and then spread. That's why the impact was much bigger than Jeju incident. And then again, at that time, the civic movement was not that widespread. In 1980, in that regard, Gwangju people are lucky. Without the fertile civic movement preparation, Gwangju incident should have been isolated as Jeju incident was. So there were even larger scale atrocities committed by government after World War II in Korea. But all those incidents were covered or not known to the people. Much bigger scale. Because the images were not kept, not many images were kept, and then the nation, the people were not ready to accept it or to propagate it or to mobilize them incident toward something.
Okay, moving on specifically to the March 1st movement, can you talk a little bit more about some of the specifics? Where did the movement start? Was it primarily a student movement? You talked a lot about the legacy, but can you briefly talk a little bit about the movement itself?
Even though I'm not a social scientist, I'm simply a linguist. So I frequently regretted my decision to become a linguist. I chose language because language gives, even now, more job opportunities. Even though I really wanted to major in social sciences. So I am not an expert in social events, but as far as I know, the event was initiated by leaders of religious leaders, like out of 33 people, the so-called representatives, 16 Christians, 15 Eastern religion, we name it Donghak or Chondogyo, and then 2 Buddhists. So they initiated the movement, but most of them simply disappeared. They were arrested initially, but they were released immediately after. The momentum of the movement, they began themselves, but they did not lead the movement. Most of them were not courageous enough. Maybe most of them were cowards. They converted themselves to be collaborators later, some of them. But some of them were executed later, like Reverend Gyonggu. He's very famous in he was a pastor in Pyongyang, and then he continued to his movement, and then he was arrested, tortured, and to death. Some were brave enough, but most of the movement, not by, at the beginning, students, but mostly by common people.
So you mentioned the religious beginnings of the movement. Is that why? So you mentioned several instances of churches being targeted and people being burned in churches. Is that the motivation for those actions of burning people in churches?
Because at that time there were no national organizations. Only Protestant churches, and then Chondogyo, they had a national network. So they mostly initiated the movement in their local places. That's why they suffered more than others.
You mentioned how the movement began with common people. We hear a lot about the agrarian nature of Korea until after the Korean War. So how were people able to stand up against a highly industrialized colonial power like Japan? What recourse did they have for this movement?
That's a quite interesting question. So at that time, the movement took place mostly in marketplace. So in Korea, until recently, we have 5-day market. Every 5 days, we have a market. People come in market every 5 days. Then at that gatherings, people propagate the leaflet, and then so they mobilize the people to participate in the demonstration. And then so even though so many people participate in demonstration, they could not fight against the armed forces. So they try to promote rather peaceful movement.
You talked a lot about the legacy of these movements, and you talked about how in Japan and in Korea the past is being reinterpreted. We've all heard about in the news how the issue of how history is taught in Japanese textbooks and Japanese schools is a problem. Do you feel like the same is true in Korea, that Korean textbooks are part of this changing, reinterpreting the nature of history?
So Korean government tried to do that, but they failed in a few months ago. So only one high school adopted that textbook with distortion on past history. Only one high school. All other high schools refused to accept that textbook. Even in Japan, only about less than 100 high schools, I'm not sure, but exact number, about 20 or 30, very small number of schools adopted the textbook with larger scale distortion. But still, that kind of existence of textbooks influenced other textbooks.
You talked a little bit about the conditions that Koreans endured under the colonial occupation, including 57% of rice production in 1931 went to Japan. Was there any chance for emigration, for Koreans to leave the Korean peninsula and seek refuge elsewhere, or did the Japanese colonial power force Koreans to stay in Korea or in Japan?
During that period, I'm not exactly sure about the number, but as far as I remember, about 5 million Koreans emigrated. So about 1 million in Japan, about 2 million in China. So many Koreans went out of Korea because they suffered a lot economically here, or they wanted to avoid the colonial rule. So many Koreans went abroad. So now they say about 7 million diaspora around the world.
Okay, I think we're about out of time for our questions, but your talk has generated a lot of questions, especially about the lasting legacy, relations between North and South Korea and Japan. And if your question was not asked, please feel free to talk to Dr. Shin directly after the talk. I'm sure he'd be happy to share his thoughts with you. But this will be the last question for the Q&A session. So I mentioned there's a lot of lasting legacy about this. However, maybe on a positive note, someone from the audience wants to know, what are you most proud of about Korea since Korea has survived all of these challenges? What are you most proud of? What are you most optimistic about Korea moving into the future?
Even though we inherited so many negative aspects of colonialism, still there is another strong stream toward just social justice, and then human rights, and then reasonable way of life, humanitarianism. That's why we almost succeeded in making Korean Peninsula quite a lot democratic. So the energy here overcame military dictatorship to a certain degree, and then overcame the legacy of colonialism. So Korean way, for example, Korean people are proud of it, which feeling I share. So China has about 50 times as many people as in Korea. Japan, about 250% more than we have. North and South put together, still Japan has twice as much population. But Japan has never created Japan wave. China never created Chinese wave around the world. Compared to them in size, and then history, and then modernization, Korea does not deserve to create that kind of cultural product. We managed to produce that level of cultural product because of the energy of the people toward justice, equality, and democracy, even though still the group inherited colonial mentality is still very strong. Still the group against them is as well strong. So I really believe that if we are united, if we work harder, we can make a better Korea, contributing more positively to the world, instead of becoming culturally colonialist or economically colonialist. The energy, the positive energy here can make contribution, as poet Tagore forecast. So I want to make GIC is one of the small tools in changing the society. So at the beginning of this year, I told my staff members, I want GIC to become more environmentally friendly. So we try to create less trash, and then we try to classify the trash, to recycle them. And then I also asked my people to join other civic organizations as a fee-paying member. Not focus on GIC only. I asked them to expand their solidarity with other organizations by being the member or doing something together. So this kind of mentality I learned from my reading, but also my experience in Gwangju as well. So in fact, the last slide, using that slide, I want to talk about this aspect of positive interpretation of March 1st movement and another movement. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Shin, for taking time to answer our questions. And thank you for the informative and interesting and I think important talk. Those of you who are regular attendees of GIC Talk know that now is the time when Dr. Shin usually thanks the speaker. However, today we have a slight change in the routine. I would like to invite all of you, especially Dr. Shin, to turn your attention to the screen.
Thanks, Dr. Shin, for your sunny personality and bright attitude.
It's really lovely to see you. I actually asked you to come to Croatia, but I know you're really busy now. So hope to see you after 6 months. And I know we will definitely see each other. Stay warm. Hi, Dr. Shin.
Thanks for your social advice. You helped me to decide my university.
Hi, Dr. Shin. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to work at the GIC. I'm very happy nowadays at the GIC. And you always make me happy.
Thank you, Dr. Shin, not just for the wonderful talk, but for everything that you do for GIC and for our community. I know I can speak for all of us when I say you're such an inspiration. Thanks again.
Dr. Shin, thank you so much for all of your support and dedication for the GIC. It's appreciated by so many people. Also, thank you for introducing me to the vegetarian buffet restaurant downtown. Thanks for everything that you
Hey,
do.
Dr. Shin, thanks for making GIC Talk possible. It's an important program for the exchange of ideas and information between and among the foreign and international communities. Just one of many things through the GIC that helps enrich the lives of everyone in the Gwangju and surrounding area, making us just one community of people living and working and learning together. And you're a big reason why all that happens. So thanks again, Dr. Shin.
So thank you, Dr. Shin, from all of us here at the GIC, and now I know we just clapped, but please, one more time, help us show our appreciation.
Thank you very much.
Make sure to join us for next week's talk when Angela Jeanette from Germany will be here to introduce the newly opened branch of the Goethe Institute for German Language Study at Chonnam National University. Also, after the talk, there will be the regular discussion group led by Audrey Dubin in one of the adjoining rooms from 4:30 to 5:30. So please feel free to stick around if you are interested in joining. Also, the Jeollanam-do Speakers and Readers Club will be meeting here from 5:30 to 6:30. Thank you all again for coming today. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Have a wonderful week, and we hope to see you all right back here next Saturday for GIC Talk.